We're all here at the invitation of the Balanchine Foundation, and this morning Basha worked with some very young dancers from the New York City Ballet in between their heavy performance schedule. They were very cooperative and wonderful, and they had been taught a Gaillard, a dance duet for two women from the Balanchine's ballet AGON'S. And Valarie and Ambre were the ones who taught them the variation. And then Basha worked with them today, showing them the original choreography that Balanchine had created on Barbara Walczak and Barbara Milberg. There are some great variations in the choreography, so it's very interesting to see these variations. And they have the notes from the Laban notation that can correct or supposed to be exactly what Balanchine showed at the time in the first rehearsals. So Barbara, can you talk about the work that you did this morning with those young dancers?
Well, it was very, very interesting. They were lovely. They worked really very, very hard. They were very willing. And I think we got a lot done. What do you think?
I agree. I agree completely, yeah.
Yeah. I wish we could do it again. And this time with the right counts and with the second choreography, because the remake of the variation is equally as interesting as the original. And the counts are very interesting, and these dancers were working without counts. So they were just working with the music.
Yes, Valarie and Ambre had not had time with the dancers to really instruct them through all the counts. And it's my feeling, and I know Basha feels the same way, that the counts are very important. Without them, the rhythmic intensity of the choreography isn't accessible to the dancers, so they understand it much less well without the counts.
Right.
So that needs to happen at a future time.
Yeah, and interestingly enough, apparently, because I didn't realize it until you mentioned it, I kept saying sharper, make it absolutely on the count, make it sharper, make it work, which would have been similar to as if they were counting. So at least we got something done. It may not have been perfect, but we accomplished quite a bit.
To explain a little bit, Basha was in the original cast as a soloist. I was in the original cast in the Corps de Ballet. And then several years later, Balanchine completely re-choreographed this Gaillard on me. So we have two different versions of the ballet really within our bodies and our brains, I think. Yes.
Definitely, yeah. Yeah.
And I think we should talk a little bit about the atmosphere when Balanchine created AGON'S. It was a very intense time. I think, just start, but I want Barbara to remember every detail. We realized something very, very, very important was happening in the studio. Perhaps not the first day, but the fact that Stravinsky was there virtually every day was already made it something very special. And we all knew something was happening. It was a feeling we had inside ourselves. Do you agree, Basha?
To some extent, yeah. Definitely, Lincoln Kirstein would be in and out. Stravinsky and Balanchine were at the piano, having slight arguments. Unfortunately, it was the Stravinsky score, which nobody had ever heard. We'd never heard it with the orchestra, had no idea what it was. The piano version of it was extremely difficult to work with. And I think the pianist was having trouble with it, and they were discussing tempos, and it was obviously a very, very new, very important work.
The pianist was Kolya, I can't remember his full name.
Kopeikin.
Kopeikin, right, Kopeikin. Thank you. And he worked really closely with Balanchine and Stravinsky, so there were constant discussions going on. Some arguments, but they were friendly arguments because Balanchine always deferred to Stravinsky. He admired him without any reserve whatsoever. So we were privileged to watch all this happening. There's a photograph that Martha Swope took of me sitting on the floor by the piano, eavesdropping. So it shows how much we were interested in what was going on. There were also guests who came in and out, some Russian guests, various people, and we didn't pay much attention to them. And I believe the Laban notators were there as well.
Yes, Billy Mahoney was there in 1957, and Ann Hutchinson, who later married Ivor Guest and became Ann Hutchinson Guest. And so they were actually writing down what Balanchine was choreographing on Barbara and Barbara at the time. And so we had their original legal pad notes that were from 1957. They were yellowing in the Special Collections archives, which live at Ohio State University. And so when Paul Bowes was out there in October, he asked if we could find the original scratch notes of Anne and Billy's, and we did. And so we were able to figure out what some of the original movements you were doing and bring them today.
I didn't realize that Stravinsky had not conducted the first performance. I guess I never looked into the pit to see who was conducting. But he and Balanchine apparently had a disagreement, and Stravinsky left. And we're all wondering what that disagreement was. When you realize what Balanchine did from the point of view of the counts and the music, his approach to that music. If we were to be singers or another instrument, he actually added another layer to Stravinsky's music with our counts. They were totally different from what the musicians were counting. And I think that was a little bit of a raw point between them, especially since up until that point, Stravinsky, the music world felt that he, as a modern composer, had never touched the 12-tone scale. And this was the first time that he had created this incredible piece of music using the 12-tone scale. And Balanchine decided he would have 12 dancers because of the 12-tone scale. So we were 12 dancers to this incredible new piece of music. And I think what Balanchine created was so revolutionary in many ways that I think he and Stravinsky had a little bit of friction.
There was one singular example of this. The end of the Gaillard, as Barbara danced it, every note had a movement on it so that it completed it's a 9 count. When he choreographed it on me, it ended very softly and without any singular gestures. And that's the way Stravinsky wanted it. What Balanchine wanted was what Basha learned, and what I learned was what Stravinsky wanted. And then afterwards, when it was choreographed again or changed a little, it went back to Balanchine's version. So in the end, he triumphed on that one little point. But the counting in Agon was completely different from anything I had ever done before. Right?
Oh, yeah.
Infinitely more complex. There would be a 9 and a 9 and an 8 and a 7 and 3 6s and two or three 3s and then a 13 and a 12 and a 2 and a 4 and all of that was in our heads. We were counting all of that with every single step.
And what made it very, very difficult was that in most ballets, whoever is across the stage from you is doing the same thing as you're doing. Mm-hmm. And in this ballet, no two people were doing the same thing. So when you hit the stage and started counting, you had nothing to check on or to make sure, am I doing this right? Am I on the right count? And we had never heard the orchestra because it was a brand new piece of music. So we had 3 orchestra rehearsals. And what the orchestra played, as opposed to what the pianist had been playing, was like night and day. Mm-hmm. And trying to count and hear the music was extremely difficult. And it was very unnerving in many ways.
I think when we first got into the theater, the first thing we noticed when we had a stage rehearsal was the lighting. Because the lighting designer, Ronnie Bates, had found some sort of lights from the airport. And they were at knee level, and they blasted us. We were completely blinded. And we had what was then very small costumes. and with these dramatic lights blinding us, we couldn't even see each other, and the noises coming from the pit that were completely unlike anything we were used to. I mean, it was terrifying. But the most extraordinary thing to me was that we all knew that we were part of the creation of a masterpiece. Do you agree, Basha? No.
No.
I felt convinced of that.
Yeah. No, the interesting thing about Balanchine was that we were his instruments, we were his tools, and we were the product that was going to come out of it. And he didn't share any information with us. We had no idea that this ballet had been brewing for 4 or 5 years, that Kirstein and Stravinsky had envisioned it as a very, very ornate, with scenery and costumes, period piece, because it was based on period music. And that Balanchine had absolutely negated all of that. And again, we were in little black leotards, and only 12 of us because it was a 12-tone scale. We didn't know anything about that. He just came in and said, okay, this is the count, this is the step, do it. So except for the fact that Stravinsky was sitting there and Russians were coming in and out, we were just learning another ballet, and a very complex one. I remember there was, and he was so specific. I remember there was in the women's section, which was for me the hardest musically. It was just, I couldn't hear anything. So on top of not hearing anything and not being able to see, it was not the greatest experience. But there was one little section, and I think it was maybe 8 counts, that he set very, very quickly, and then he went to go across the room to the other, and I was saying, Mr. B, wait, I don't get it. Off he went, and he was showing the other side, and it was different from what he had done for me. And I just thought there was those 8 counts, so I did the best I could with it. I thought, okay, I think this was it. And he never said anything. After I left the company, I came back to, they were redoing it, and I came back to help him with my part. And we got to this section, and he did those 8 counts. I said, Mr. B, that's it. He said, no, you're the one who did it wrong. So that is how clear he was in his mind as to specifically what he wanted. He had really worked this out down to every detail. But we were just his instruments. We didn't know, we were just learning the steps. We had no idea that this had been going on for years, that this was, for Stravinsky, a whole new thing with the 12-tones. We didn't know, and maybe it's just as well, because we'd have gotten even more nervous. But we were just his instruments, and we were doing what he told us to do.
Do you have some thoughts on Agon and on staging it that you'd like to share?
Well, I think one of the things that we discovered was that it is really tied to the counts, and it completely parallels Stravinsky's score. So the notation score completely parallels the musical score. And one of the things that we learned today, we have some blank spots in our score where there's just nothing happening. And then I was hearing Barbara say, oh, you've got to strike it there. Don't just throw it away, finish it. And so those were those moments of pause that we had where nothing's going on in our score. And that was really interesting because that's a part of the style that's embedded in there, but didn't quite come through with just the one rehearsal. Yeah.
I just think in thinking about some of the other ballets that Val and I have had the honor of staging from La Notation, like Tchaikovsky Pas de Deux in comparison to Agon, that work is much more traditional, classical movement, and the musicality, it's obviously Tchaikovsky, was a lot easier to maneuver and count through. There wasn't, as you were saying, there was 6 and a 7 and a 9 in Agon. So when we did begin working with the Agon score, that was something we knew that we really needed to be clear on. It was a thread that was holding things together for us.
And it's the counts that the dancers used to argue about all the time. I don't know if it's the same 8 counts, but there's a section where there are dancers in 3 quartets, 2 women's quartets and a quartet of men here, and they all move around like sort of chess pieces. And I think Basha and I were both in Diana Adams' group, and there was another 4 women in Melissa Hayden's group, and we went back like this, and then we crossed, and as we crossed, we all spit the counts at each other because Millie's group was always wrong, or we thought so anyway. So we would correct each other. But the most incredible thing was that we all thought, this is a great ballet, even though you didn't realize that it was a masterpiece, Basha. And I think I enjoyed it more because I was so new in the company, perhaps uncritical of anything. But we thought it would take a long time for the public to be interested in Agon, because for the 4 temperaments, Hindemith, it took years before the public appreciated that ballet. The night we opened at City Center, the audience went crazy. They loved it. It was the right time, the right place, the right dancers, the right everybody participating. It was just all right. It came together, and I think it was considered a great work that evening, without any.
Well, I think Billy Westlow told me, I don't remember, that Balanchine was standing in the wings, and we got to the Diana Adams section, the pas de deux with Arthur Mitchell, which was at that time very revolutionary and very avant-garde. And Balanchine heard a few snickers in the audience, and he said to Billy, "Oh, they don't like it." And then at the end, the audience erupted in applause, and he realized that he had a great success, which I thought is interesting.
Yeah. Well, dancers and musicians, all of us were absolutely thrilled that it had struck such an important note with the audience, with the public. It's interesting, too, that when he was choreographing Agon, it was right after our European tour when his wife, Tanaquil Leclerc, had contracted polio on the tour. And she was, by the time he was doing Agon, she was, I think, at home in New York. But he was creating Agon in one studio, Square Dance in another, and Stars and Stripes almost at the same time.
Yeah.
And taking care of his wife, to do exercises with her every day to keep her alive. I mean, it was an extraordinary time in the man's life. So I think that's part of the whole experience there.
The other theory that I have, and I wish he could come and tell me what he's thinking, is that the dancers he chose and the choreography, by choosing a dancer like Todd Bolander, Todd was the closest, I would say, to a kind of a Fred Astaire ballet dancer. He had that very wonderful kind of loose way of moving. And the choreography suited that. And it was as if, very much like the music, which was going into the 12-tone scale, going from one to another to another. The first pas de trois was very much almost looking back choreographically. And the second pas de trois was a little bit more forward-looking, although I must say that the variation for the 2 men in the second pas de trois was much more classical, but very reminiscent of the 2 guys in Prodigal Son, choreographically.
Oh, you're right. You're right.
Very, very, very similar. Mm-hmm. And then as the music progressed, when we got to the pas de deux, it became totally avant-garde, totally new. And it was almost as if he were going through different stages in his choreography in the ballet itself. And when you see it in that sense, it really makes a lot of sense.
He was developing himself through the
Yes,
process.
yes, yeah.
And through the conversations, interaction with Stravinsky.
Yeah.
Right.
Right.
Balanchine was interested in Laban notation, so I think he never knew what might just catch his fancy and sort of tweak something intellectually, but he was very interested in seeing what the notators were producing and seeing how closely it resembled his choreography. Do Do you know, either of you know something about that, and from his conversations with Anne Hutchinson in particular?
Well, he took classes from Anne. She met him backstage at a performance in San Francisco, and she was introduced to him, and he became fascinated. I mean, she had such a vivacious personality and made anything sound interesting. And so he became a pupil of hers and studied with her and invited her in to notate well over 20 of his works herself. And then, of course, she would bring teams of training notators with her. And, then Billy Mahoney was a professional notator as well. She would bring Els Greilinger, who was with her at the time in the 40s and 50s and 60s. And so he was a avid supporter of Laba notation, and really, in large part due to Mr. Balanchine and Lincoln Kirsten, is why it was so, it became so popular in the 60s. And so it was, they were very big supporters. And so she was able to travel all over the world and notate many different ballets.
But the reason I think it's so important is that, which is what we're working on right now, is that word of mouth, going from generation to generation to generation, things get changed. If you try now putting it on film deteriorates. Whereas Laba notation is perfect.
It's still there. It was still
exactly.
on the same page from 1957.
Yeah,
it was a little
right.
crumbly, but it was still
and
there.
And you have exactly what was meant to be.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I also wonder about Balanchine at the time. There was a lot of discussion in the early 50s and even into the 60s about copyright laws and ownership of choreography. And that was one way to have ownership of your choreography, is to have it set in a written format. And so I wonder, again, it's just conjecture, how much that also came into play with his wanting to get things put down on paper. And then, of course, growing up in Russia, again, I'm sure he was exposed to Stepanov notation, or what was used there in Russia to record some of the ballets. And again, we have no proof of this. We can just kind of look at his background and what was happening here in the world around copyright laws.
That's a really important point, Amber, because I know that Barbara Horgan, who was the one who worked on getting Balanchine ballets copyrighted, needed that documentation. Just talking about them or seeing a film wasn't enough for the Library of Congress. So that I can't imagine that. I think he was really fascinated with the process of notation, that intrigued him. But then Barbara urged him on to get those scores that could be copyrighted. It was an important thing to do. I think it's not another 20 years and everything will be public domain.
That's what I've heard.
Yeah. Disney changed it from 50 years to 70. So there's that extra time now, but it's running out.
Yeah.
Wow.
And then it's chaos.
Yeah, who knows what will happen, right?
Yeah, many versions of many ballets. Yes.
Right. Yeah.
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 Let's talk a little bit about your experiences before there even was a New York City Ballet, Barbara. Ballet Society and the opening, the first performance of the New York City Ballet at City Center.
Wow. It was, and what was it, the
Needle trades.
Needle
High
trades.
School of
High
Needle
School of
Trades, yeah.
There were no dressing rooms except for one. And again, Balanchine, under the worst of circumstances, was as calm as a cucumber.
Right.
Nothing fazed him. So consequently, we just went through it as if nothing happened. We got there, we put our costumes on, we did it. It was, no big deal. With the early company from those Ballet Society days, Betty Cage was trying to figure out how we could get an audience. And we were all the dancers were trying to help out, how are we going to make this thing work? And I remember we had some posters. And Barbara Milberg and I started in the Village. And we went to every florist shop and every shop that we thought that they might put them up. And we gave them out all over the city, that we were going to be performing. We thought maybe we could do posters in the subways, but that was way out of our budget. It was really a community effort. And there's a wonderful story at City Center on the 5th floor. There were no dressing rooms. That Balanchine and Edward Bigelow would sit and they would fix the costumes themselves. They would actually sit there and sew. So it was like everybody chipped in. It was like a family. We were really so like a family, trying to make this whole thing work. I remember there was a rehearsal of Bourrée Fantasque. And at that time, just about everybody who was in the company was in it, because it was a very small company. And this was in the studios on Madison Avenue, way, way back. And it was getting to be like, the rehearsal was supposed to go, I think, till 10 at night. And Balanchine was trying to do the finale. And the whole studio was filled with dancers because almost every dancer that was in the company was there. And Balanchine asked us, would we please not tell the union, would we please stay another half hour or more till he could finish it and not have to pay us overtime? And of course we said yes. And naturally, standing there, while he was with the pianist, he was figuring it out, we would start talking, and everybody was saying, please keep it down, keep it down, keep it down. And he finished it. We finished it within an hour. It was all done. And but this is the way the company ran at that time. It was really a family that was working together to make something work. I mean, to give you an example, we were in Europe. We were on a train going, I don't remember, I think we were going to Munich. And we were told that on arrival, right at the station, there would be a interview with radio and television and the whole thing. And the word got around that Balanchine has lost his little black bow tie. And so I took tissue ribbon and I sewed tissue ribbon together, 2 ribbons, and I gave it to him. And he wore it. And afterwards, he very elegantly returned it to me and said, thank you.
Well, he was an elegant gentleman.
Yes.
But
yeah.
nothing was beneath him.
No.
Like
no.
sewing the costumes. When there's a hole in somebody's costumes, he'd sit down and sew
Right.
it.
Yeah.
Probably have to do it over. The wardrobe people would come and get it and do it over. But
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
But so it was a very different atmosphere. It was, he was always the boss. He was always someone that you were kind of in fear of and tried to, hoped he would like things. I mean, the worst thing, and he was a very quiet man, very understated, quiet, never lost his temper. And the worst thing that could happen to you, and you really wanted a trapdoor to open under you, if in the middle of class you'd be doing something, and he would walk up to you and say, no, dear, wrong. That would be the end of the world. But he was a very demanding, but very quiet, very demanding. And the interesting thing that I find that changed was that in the early years of the company, he had a group of dancers that did not have perfect bodies, that were not all trained the same way, and he really took it upon himself to remake us. And he was changing dance from being from pose to pose, very elegant, very, very romantic, to being jazzy, to being off balance, to being throw your leg and be off balance and fall over and whatever. And in order to do that, he broke everything down to the basics. And we did it over and over and over. And it was his way or no way. There was no interpreting. There was no doing it your way. There was no mannerisms. You did it his way. And you did class every single day. And as you said, on days off, if you had a Monday off, of course you didn't not attend class. The class might go on for 2.5 hours. And it was with no music. It was dead silence. All you had was a little clap. Mm-hmm. And, and steps that were torture. They were never dancey. It was never like, oh, I'm going to fly across the floor. They were very difficult, very pedantic steps. But that is how he created a whole new form of dance, a whole new body shape, a whole new concept. And there's a very interesting story in the early years when we first did Symphony in C. We still had footlights then. And he was sitting with the lighting person, Jean Rosenthal at that time. And she was saying, shall we turn up the footlights? And he said, no, 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 not yet. Their feet aren't good enough yet. No, keep it down. He had this vision of what the bodies would look like and what dancers would look like. And he was perfectly willing to work with whatever material he had, even though it wasn't perfect. Mm-hmm. And then slowly, 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 he developed what he wanted.
And in his work, there was nothing about inspiration. When he was creating a new ballet, you didn't feel like he came into the studio inspired or that he was inspired during the process. It was just work. If it was going well, he could keep going forever. If he said, maybe we should go have coffee, that meant he was a little stuck in a ballet and would spend a lot of time with the accompanist. But it was all about the work. There was no, fire in the brain. It was just the work produced a product in the end. And sometimes it was great, and sometimes it wasn't as good, and that's the way life is. Yeah. And we should mention the other ballet that you spoke about, that you worked on this morning, which is Symphony in C, which I think has changed about the least of any of the ballets that I've seen recently. Yeah.
Well, we were comparing notes because the two of us were fast learners and we could pretty much do anything. How many movements in Symphony in C and how many parts we all danced. Because again, if somebody got sick, you had to pinch hit, you had to go in. So many of us danced, in two different movements in the same evening.
Yeah, right. And as Basha said, there's so much of classical ballet is the people on this side are a mirror image of the people on that side. So, but in Symphony in C, we were always being sent to the other side, and you didn't even have time to think. You all of a sudden had to reverse all the steps, which was a challenge. I kind of enjoyed that.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. I remember that one Symphony in C, I danced the first movement demi-solo, and I was on stage left, and the second movement chord comes on stage right. And the conductor was told to wait because I had to come bow, run off stage, run all the way across the back, and be ready to come on for the second movement.
Well, I had a slightly different experience. I was doing the principal role in the fourth movement for the first time, and I also had to do the demi-solo in the third movement. So I ran off stage at the end of the third movement. Somebody clapped a tiara on my head, and I stood there, and I waited. And I waited, and Robert Irving, our conductor, waited and waited. No one had they'd taught me the steps, but no one had told me I had to run out and pose, and then he would start. So it went on and on and on. What's going on? Finally, Robert just started, and I ran on. But it was such, that's what was how it happened. Yeah. Well, we were very, very fortunate to be with Balanchine when he was so active. Both of us. I mean, Basha first and then me a little bit later. But we were really good times when he was in the studio with us all the time. And it's our opportunity and our good fortune to be able to pass that on to dancers now who are so eager to learn and to hear what his work was like.
Yeah.
So thank you so much. And
thank you.
Thank you all for
Yes.
good work, and thank you for filming us.